Hello, everyone. My name's George Barker. I work for Gazelli Art House. Welcome to Gazelli Connect. This afternoon, we're pleased to present a conversation between artist Michael Takeo Magruder and curator Aaron Rosen. Over the past 20 years, Takeo Magruder's projects have been showcased in almost 300 exhibitions in 35 countries. Among the many institutions he's exhibited include the British Museum, the Pompidou Center at Paris, the Nam June Paik Art Center in Seoul, and the Tokyo Metropolitan Museum of Photography, among many others. Michael will be in conversation with Dr. Aaron Rosen, Professor of Religion and Culture and the Director of the Henry Luce III Center for the Arts and Religion in Washington, D.C. Rosen began his career at Yale, Oxford, and Columbia universities after receiving his doctorate from the University of Cambridge. Rosen is the author of several books, including Imagining Jewish Art, Art and Religion in the 21st Century, and Brushes with Faith, the last two of which feature Michael's work. Michael is also part of Dr. Rosen's project Home Alone Together, which shows artists and their practice at home during the quarantine. Bit of housekeeping before we start. The audience will be muted, and if you could turn off your video in order to keep the streaming and sound quality high, we would appreciate that. You'll all get the opportunity to ask questions by writing them in the comment section, which I'll relay to Michael and Aaron at the end of the conversation. So we'll have a chance to do a bit of a Q&A afterwards. I don't know where you want to start. Aaron, do you want to kick off with Michael, first of all?
Sure. Thank you, George. And it's great to have an event with Gazelli, which represents really the best of London galleries to me. So it's fun being an expat a couple of times over to have a chance to connect back with Britain. So Michael, I have a few questions to start with, and then we'll see where things take us. But the first one is, this is obviously the apocalypse, right? Do you agree that we're in the apocalypse now? Because you're a student of the apocalypse. You created a lot of work about it.
Yes. But as you know, during that project that you're referring to, Decoding the Apocalypse, which we collaborated on, how many years ago now? Maybe 6 years ago? With
back when the world was ending slowly.
Yes. Well, no, it was back when the world was ending differently. And I guess that's one of the things that I remember most from the sort of the research part of that project is sort of kind of looking through history and looking at the notions of apocalypse and seeing how that kind of cross-referenced into political and pop culture in certain sort of time periods, and how really you have all these moments throughout history where people are talking about their time being the apocalypse. So fast forward to today, I mean, certainly for a lot of younger people, this will be the most traumatic thing they've had to actually experience. It'll be a very transformative thing, really, I think, for many people. But will it be the apocalypse? No. No, certainly not. I mean, it's, in many ways it will be different, but no more sort of a trial than the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Or no more.
Every generation gets its own.
Absolutely.
Gets the apocalypse it deserves, right?
Well, I think it's more that when we think about the apocalypse, because as you know, the original meaning of the word is unveiling. It tells us less about sort of what we're worried about in terms of a future, but more about sort of our preoccupations in the here and the now. The things that have been kind of playing on our mind, and of course, so as we've kind of discussed over the last few months in various of our conversations, how this particular epidemic of coronavirus is really, yes, it's this horrible global health emergency, but what is more perhaps problematic is just all the things that it's forcing to the surface, that it's uncovering, all the kind of social inequities, inequalities, the all these underlying problems that we have in our different cultures, in our global, economy, in our societies in East and in West. And yeah, these things are kind of coming to the surface.
Right. And as you mentioned, in terms of unveiling the original term apocalypse and the name of the book of Revelation, or as every American seems to say, Revelations. Which actually is a profound difference, whether it's one comprehensive vision or it's a amalgamation or a stew of different ones. But is that, and also I think Revelations gives a sense that it's an unfurling of ordered things, whereas the vision to me is much more of like lucid dreaming or fever dreams. But one of the things that I see, of course, in biblical scholarship in recent decades is a focus on the geopolitics of the time that St. John is writing. And so certainly as we talk about the apocalypse now, that gives us the opportunity to say, well, if even then the vision of the deep projected future was about an acute awareness of the political realities of the time, that it's also very helpful to sort of stir our conversation as well, is that remembering that as we look eschatologically towards the future, the most important and the most trenchant visions are the ones that reveal the present. And that's certainly what we see in, the great films like The Seventh Seal, right? That Ingmar Bergman, that it's the most dramatic and best rendering of the anxieties of the Cold War era and being on the brink of a nuclear holocaust is set in an apocalyptic imagination, set back in time, looking to the future, right? So apocalypses can also bring elements of hope, right? So there's, as you say, the unveiling is not just something that reveals the fault lines and the fractures of society, but it also can reveal a radical hope to how to repair these kind of ruptures. And I thought that was very interesting in your Decoding the Apocalypse exhibition, that you looked at the vision of the New Jerusalem. And just as so often we see that catastrophe is a time of great urban planning and regeneration, even in the Great Fire of London, right, led to replanning London as we know it today, something you've looked at in your Imaginary Cities project. What elements of hope do you see right now? Or how as an artist do you have your antennae up for elements of hope as well as tragedy right now?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I've been talking with quite a number of people, both colleagues and friends and family alike, is that the given situation we're having to live through right now, of course, no reasonable person would wish this upon the world. But given that we're here, we're going to have to deal with this, that it is going to have this transformative effect on our society and our small communities, our families, our friendships, our jobs. Really, it's going to be a very pervasive thing. That it does actually, I think, provide us kind of a unique opportunity to, reconsider, to reflect, to kind of see things differently, because we're being forced to live so differently. My daughter is now 20. She's up in Liverpool. And she's a second-year computer science student there at the University of Liverpool. And she is there with her flatmate, isolating, and has been for the last several months, like everyone else. And one of the first conversations I had with her is, because of course she was worried. She was worried not in particular about herself, but what if I got sick? Being that you and I were kind of in the start to get into sort of the at-risk group, and I
keep saying this. I categorically deny this.
Okay, fine.
I'm in the prime of youth.
I'm starting to get in my sort of in the at-risk group, but at any case, she was very worried about this, and also just was really kind of focusing on the downsides and the problems, which are significant. But I told her, I said, well, we're going to have to live through this, so use it as an opportunity. Use it as an opportunity to get a glimpse of things in a way that you will have probably never had the opportunity before. Because in such a time of great crisis, the normal facades, the normal things that kind of either institutions or people, they kind of put up, the walls that we build, these facades, they start to like break down. And you can really start to see, both with individuals and institutions alike, what are people saying? What are people doing? How are they reacting to things? And you really kind of get a different kind of glimpse, maybe something that's closer to, the truth of things and your relationships, and it allows you to kind of reassess things. And I thought, what? This is actually a very positive thing. Another positive thing, if, going back to the whole sort of issue of social inequalities and other sort of underlying problems with society, is that this makes, I think, a situation like this makes most people confront them in a way that they haven't had to before. Mm-hmm. So, we could talk about, say, environment. Most reasonable people would understand the issues that we're facing with climate change and the climate crisis. And of course, in the lead up to this, we've had all these kind of discussions about, but I need to fly. I need to do this for my work. I need to do this for my sort of social life, so on and so forth. And because we have been forced to adopt this different way of life and work, all of a sudden, some of those arguments don't, now we have proof, we have evidence. We have sort of lived evidence that we don't have to be this way. So, my hope, my positive thing I would say that could come out of all this is that it really does allow us to reassess things. And if we learn, we take sort of the things that have worked well, and we integrate that into our society, our culture, our homes. Once we emerge, we can do certain things better, and that can have a positive impact.
And it's interesting that I was searching in the early days after the pandemic began for analogies in my lifetime. And actually, for me, it was a personal tragedy of losing my sister. And of course, in some ways, natural to think about the potential loss of loved ones in this time. But actually, the thing that struck me that I think of great relevance to people generally is that I remember feeling in that first year of grief a tremendous sense of moral acuity. Who was on the right side of the ledger? Who was, sheeps and goats, wheat and chaff. I felt that everything was really binary. And I think there's that similar moment as we're living through it now in a collective sense of grief. For those who were able to feel grief, for people which we're seeing dubiously an incapacity in some places, but that you see everything clarified, and that's again that sort of that almost like prophetic sense, and I think that's a part of the moral imagination, which for those who want to see it in a particular light has a theological relevance there. Because it's about viewing the world as it is or as it should be. And it's these moments when things begin to veer off of course that you realize that you had a fabricated sense of how things should be, and that implicit nature of your reality has been sort of peeled away. So let's talk a little bit about how, as an artist, you respond, because in some ways there's a great tradition, I think, especially in Britain, of having war artists, and I kind of wonder whether we'll have something like that now, where and we have the Arts Council, we have other organizations that are stepping up to the plate, to use an American metaphor for British approaches to the arts, who are recognizing that we need to support artists, but we also have to harness artists' ability to help others, right? So as we look at sort of, we know who the first wave responders are, but if we think about that second and that third wave, recording and processing this trauma is so important. And we've begun to see projects like artists doing portraits of workers for the NHS, which has yielded some really amazing results. But what do you see as an artist who's responding this time? Do you think of yourself a bit like a war artist, of like everything's very confusing and how to focus on certain stories? How is it that you sort of look to navigate your way artistically through this?
Well, those are some really good points you raise. And I would actually the first thing that comes to mind is, I think, really kind of my long-standing thread of my practice, which looks at what someone like Alfredo Cramerati would, who's a curator and well-known writer, has written about aesthetic journalism. So that's kind of work that exists in this gray area between an artistic practice and a journalistic practice. It's sort of taking from both those worlds. And certainly a lot of the projects that I've done and many of our collaborations, I would say, fit within that kind of realm. And I guess the main difference is for me as an artist sort of working in this area where I'm looking at these kind of important social and ethical issues of our time, often surrounding certain events or histories, that I'm not trying to tell the whole sort of factual story. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to sort of take a time to, of course, get a very clear understanding from a variety of perspectives, whether that's from various kind of news media, across the globe, or sort of the takes of governments, or say of private citizens in different areas of the world. That it's not to just simply relay those, in a sense, facts, if you will, even though, facts in inverted commas, but to maybe kind of get a deeper, more nuanced understanding and reflection of what's going on. So I think of it more as like building these spaces for reflection, for dialogue, for consideration, because one of the things that we've certainly seen in the last several decades with the onset of the information age is really kind of the deluge of media and information, and sort of it becomes very difficult to separate the signal from the noise and to get a perspective that, as an artist, of course, we all, I'm an individual, I have my prejudices, I have my sort of my life, which informs the way I view and the way I sort of present things. But to get something that's a more balanced perspective, that I'm not trying to, if I'm building an artistic experience, and especially one that's research-based, and it's on a sensitive topic, and I try to show sort of different sides to a story, and in relationships, that's another thing that's important, that I'm not trying to, say, go out and sell a story or get someone to vote for me. It's more just, as an artist, kind of coming and saying, okay, here's the situation, here are these series of contexts, here is what I've discovered, and here's a space to kind of, for you, the viewer, the participant, to come in, to take this, these findings of mine, and then use that as kind of a starting point for your own journey.
Right. And it's interesting, leaping off some of what you're saying there, is that, our conversations, I think I introduced you to someone as a digital artist, and you gave me this icy glare, right? So because I think then that becomes someone who is simply just representing or channeling data, right?
Yes, absolutely.
We live in a great age. I think the reporting has been very strong from the Washington Post and the New York Times, in particular, during this moment. And then also early on, the Johns Hopkins, of course, with its representation and tracking of coronavirus deaths worldwide. It was one of the first resources that you shared with me, actually, because you were one of the first people to have their antennae up and recognizing what was happening about this crisis. We live in a time of excellent resources for the presentation of data. So it's interesting that actually, I might draw an analogy to the arrival of photography, which some people thought would be the death of painting, right? But instead it challenged to move in other directions and to clarify what it could bring to the table differently. And I think similarly, because we're living in, I think, a golden age, not just of miniseries and television, but a golden age of the representation and accessibility of data, then it's forced you, in particular, who knows that scene, to say, well, how does the artist find his or her way around around the contours of this. How do you literally sort of navigate these spaces? Because that data can also be confusing, it can be inhumane, and it can also be very, it can be trapped really in the moment as well. And so as an artist also, you have an opportunity to look to the more distant horizon. So I think for
Aaron, I think you're covering your mic.
It's always possible.
Yes,
I mean,
that's
a
better.
very savvy commentator on technology. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm lucky I can even talk on this thing. So is I endow technology with these magical properties, obviously. I envision actual literal monsters lying in the deep. So one of the things that might be confusing for people is to think, how is it that you approach data? Because I remember in a meeting we once had, I think it was in King's College London, that someone said, so you just do a Google search? And you said, no, absolutely not. I don't. The way I do a dive for data is totally different than what you lay people do. So,
yes.
Just as it's interesting for people to learn about how a painter prepares a canvas, which can actually be much trickier than people think. How is it that you prepare data? How is it that you go looking for data in some of the projects that you've done?
Okay, well, I'll address that, but I'm just aware that a lot of people, we've talked about things like I've brought up the work I've done with Alfredo on aesthetic journalism through the years and projects like that, and other things like decoding. And some people that have joined us today might not actually probably aren't aware of these particular works. So let me just share a few things on the screen. I'm just going to pull this from my website here. So this here is the the project that I did on the Madrid train bombings. It's called In Remembrance 11M. So I had done that in 2010 for the for Manifesta. That year it was actually held in Spain, in Murcia and Cartagena. And when I was approached by the curators of the biennial to do a project, they wanted me to do something that had sort of international, national, regional, and local significance. And I just said, well, there really is only one thing to choose. It's the Madrid train bombings, because of course it was a very important sort of moment of national history, but it also kind of fell within the wider sort of discourse on the war on terror and things like that, of course, at the time. And that project began with really kind of a year-long research process where I was doing a deep data dive, both on surface web, so like, say, social media, news media sites, things you get through www, but also on the dark web, so things that are kind of hidden, things that exist through you can only access through, like, say, Tor, so the Onion router, basically the hidden web, if you will, of kind of private networks and such. So these are just some images of the final show that was there at Muram for the biennial. And as you can see, it's a very, dare I say, it's physical objects. It is bits of information that have been then translated into these artistic forms. You can see sculpture, photography, painterly elements, video, so on and so forth. But one of the things that I wanted to do with this show is that everything here, unlike most things where it's like you come into the exhibition and you just look and it's a very kind of hands-off experience, all of these were usable items or things that you could even take away. Like if I go back here, I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor on the screen share, but there on the plinth, there's a series of photographs that I had produced that were part of my research archive that had been sort of these thousands of images with the links, the URLs that track back through the stories, the sources that I got them from. And written sort of on the plinth was, please take one. So at the beginning of every day, the museum stewards would come out and they would put down several new 100 new photographs. So thousands of these things were taken. There was a publication there. As you can see on the other plinth, there was a book you could look through, a computer terminal with information as well. So again, this idea of me showing my process quite literally, the results of the process, but in a way that was interactive, if you will, through physical media and objects. So kind of going against the normal sort of, this is on a plinth, we are in a white cube, sacrosanct space, don't touch. Everything there was like said, please touch, please use it, and take it away. And, really when I think about projects like this, if you take away all that research process, all that sort of digital work, the kind of thing that underpins what I produce, then you really do have a room full of nothing, even if the final things end up as these physical objects or experiences. And in terms of how I go about it, that's a difficult thing for me to kind of to answer or succinctly, because I just see it as kind of this sum total of my life and the kind of the things that I've done really since I was really young. I mean, I built my first computer. It was like a 286, when I was a young teenager, when sort of computer parts first started, coming onto the gray market, back when there were only a handful of providers. And I remember early networks, sort of black and green screens, bulletin boards, early web. I've had the same email address for the last 25 years or something. So, it's my training is in science and technology. It's the kind of things that I've just done throughout my life, sort of finding information, understanding those communities. I'm an avid gamer. I spend a lot of time in shared virtual environments.
Don't mention that part. Just kidding. Don't mention it. I remember one of the images you shared with me recently. I was like, "Oh, that's great." And you're like, "I'm gaming." I was like, "Tetris? What?" So apparently, there's other games. So what's interesting there is that when I asked you to reflect on data, you drove the conversation, I think very pragmatically towards your work about the bombing in Spain, but also this sense that for your viewers, you want to break down those boundaries between numbers and life, but also for yourself, that it really is,
yes,
that it's an artificial distinction. So when I'm asking you about data, in a way, it's a very naive question, because what you're saying is that this is how you experience your life. And I the other day when you sent photos for our Home Alone Together project hosted by Image, is that for the first time, I found out that you had a window in front of you behind your screen that you're looking at right now. And yes, I always assumed you were just located in this hermetic pod. And then you just got teleported to your bed afterwards when it was time to sleep or nourish yourself. And so, but we experience so much life through these portals, and those boundaries are intrinsically blurry. And so it simply is that those things that seem esoteric or intimidating to others because they're numeric or they involve coding are just simply less so for you. Those are not so ethereal. Those are tactile things and part of your experience reality, even if you're experiencing it in some cases, through the screen. And so it's just breaking down sort of, probably anodyne and outdated ideas of what constitutes real experience.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I would go even further and say that even though many people still feel that data and technology at a certain level is alien and separated from their life, a lot of what I've always tried to do is show how that even if people feel that way, it is very much a part of their life, a part of society, sort of running under the surface. and absolutely does affect people. One of the things that I just remember kind of lectures that I gave about sort of a decade ago when the notion of kind of big data was becoming more prevalent in sort of public discourse, and giving lectures to, large bodies of art students and saying things like, okay, we need to think about big data. This is a part, of all our life. And then, of course, I would talk about things in terms of finance, in terms of science, media, so on and so forth. But I think one of the things that really got, it home to people is I would take out of my wallet and I'd show my Tesco card. I'd say, this is big data. And then sort of they'd start to think about it. And I'd talk about, how this was tracking us, our purchases, the times we visit, the relationships between what we buy, when we buy it, and not just for me, but say all the people that visit that store, and then all the people in the country. And then sort of, and then when you look at something like this, something that most of the students in the class this would not have made their top 10 list of big data.
Yeah.
And yet it's one of the most important things.
It's really illuminating. And I think especially at a time when we're becoming, at least in my household, dubiously Amazon dependent, is that we forget that a lot of the technology that we're used to from our corporate overlords is that Jeff Bezos developed Amazon with books almost as an incidental commodity, because he saw it as outdated and an easy class of intelligentsia that you could basically purge, because book collectors are beautiful souls, but not necessarily those who are most live and adaptable technologically. And so he could track everyone's buying habits and acclimatize them to low-risk goods, and then gradually build out a platform from this. So really from those early days of the internet, when in some cases it was kind of the Wild West and search results were being kind of tabulated by hand, but also that beginning of that encroachment and that sort of data, that is very interesting to say. If you're not seeing that, you're not really seeing your world, and also you're seeing it really comes into questions of autonomy and determinism. And from that, I want to jump into a really great question that we got from the audience, which is, how do you bridge the conceptual and the physical, especially in terms of religion, which is not a physical thing? Now, as a religion scholar, I think this is a great question, because I think it really gets to the core of how it is that we do or don't define religion. Because a lot of religious studies scholars have wanted to say, no, religion is actually even more a physical thing, which might seem antithetical to people, but say you don't have religion unless you have the praying, the fabrics, the books, that's the stuff, but do you think, how do you think of religion? Because I think it is very interesting to think about this question of transcendence and the esoteric. Do you see that as, how do you approach religion in your work? And do you see things that are invisible as being linked in some way to another reality?
Okay, yeah, there's a lot there. Where to start? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that I guess I should say that I was raised as a Christian. I come from the East Coast of the U.S. My family is Christian, and that upbringing has certainly informed my worldview, my ethical views. But I think also, quite importantly, that religion, if you look in the West, sort of something like Christianity, something like, say, Revelation, the book of Revelation, has really kind of made a mark through history, in all senses of it. I mean, you just think, you look at sort of pop culture today, you look at sort of how, the intersections between art, religion, technology, society at particular time points, they're just so very close. And So that's the first thing that kind of comes to mind. So that even though I don't really ever look to go and produce a religious work for a religious audience explicitly, that I can dialogue very closely with the with sort of themes of Christianity, or and I say Christianity because I actually haven't had the opportunity yet to do a project that explores Judaism. I have done one project.
When you get sophisticated enough, I'm going to open the door for you and allow you Judaism. But even in Judaism, we say, you study the Bible, then you only get to Talmud at a certain age, and it's not till your 30s that you study Zohar and mysticism, right? So you're just and for the Goyim, for the non-Jews, even more so. Yeah, you got to be 60, 70.
So I'm young in this and inexperienced. Maybe someday I'll get to kind of broaden my horizons. But even at sort of the projects that I've done, which have looked at sort of notions that relate to the Bible, none of those projects I've sort of made for a Christian audience, because I think for me, I just think about it in terms of making for a Western audience, or even a global audience. Christianity has absolutely influenced history, influenced our culture. The connections are there. And
you find your way towards religious questions because you're interested in primary cultural questions, primary ethical questions. So for you, it does seem like it's a little less about things that are invisible per se, but actually, what are the meta questions underlying visible, palpable problems?
Well, on sort of the idea of taking something that's invisible, or just, I think actually the decoding, maybe we should go back and I'll show a short video of that project, just so people can see how I've taken this idea of looking at the book of Revelation and taking it into a contemporary art exhibition. Because that particular text, it's so visceral. There's so many parts of it that you would say you could argue can really only exist as the written word, because it's so much about the imagination. And then, of course, one of the things I was always worried about doing in that project, in particular the New Jerusalem piece, was that I was taking something that was very poetic and based on using the reader's imagination, and then giving it this definitive form, in an experience grounded in through my artistic lens. So it was well received, both in sort of the wider audience, but also with theologians. So I hope I can say I got the right balance. But just for our people that are joining us, let me just play. I'll screen share a quick video, and it's got myself and Alfredo talking about. Now, this was the original show that was 2014 at Somerset House. Let me just share this.
My name is Michael Takeo Magruder. I'm a visual artist and researcher working with many digital technologies, everything from mobile devices, code, virtual worlds, live data.
My name is Alfredo Cramerotti. I'm a curator. In this occasion, I'm actually working to support Michael's work. This exhibition specifically, it has an interesting mix between very traditional, established, important art forms and sort of a reconstituted and represented with cutting-edge technology.
I wrote a foreword for the show, which talks of my thoughts when I was 8 years old, growing up in DC. And it was, of course, during the height of the Cold War, where revelation and sort of the end of times was, of course, a common theme, because there were points in that early childhood where we were very close to nuclear war. I read Revelations for the first time, and I wondered if John the Seer was talking of locust hordes and falling stars, because he couldn't describe Apache helicopters and missiles falling from the sky. And when I sort of came to the idea for this sort of deck, I started to sort of wonder, well, my daughter, what does she fear? What does she hope? So that's really what I wanted to do with this exhibition, so to take this really seminal text and ask people, okay, in this day, in this time, what are your locusts? What are your falling stars? The Horus's technology installation is the one that I created of my own desire. The other 4 installations are based on my reactions to and discussions with the research of 4 theologians based at King's College in London. So the main focus of the installation is an actual physical horse skull. Everything else in the room is based off a digitization of that. Once it is in the digital space, then it can be transformed, it can be replicated. You have the light boxes of the zeros and ones, the digital DNA, if you will. You have the 3D wireframes sort of emerging out of blackness. And then you have the physical manifestation, so the 3D printed objects, which are actually being created there in real time in the gallery.
It is about questions. It is about actually what we're doing here, where we come from, which is obviously something that art has always done, since cave paintings to coding.
Apocalypse, even though yes, we see it as destruction, the original context of the word is actually unveiling. And certainly as an artist, that's what I've tried to do.
So hopefully that can kind of give people a sense of how I take, say, in that case, a biblical text and use that as the basis for a show.
Let's jump into a couple more really good questions that we've, Michael. And one, and I think relates to this, some of the content you just showed, is do you think religion sets boundaries for art? It was clearly influencing art in the past, it's commentary, but how does it inform art today? So certainly we know that certain people wish that religion would define the boundaries of art, usually quite cynically, Rudy Giuliani and others, and the Catholic League and a few organizations which exist largely to antagonize good artists, but and to try to glom onto that for a last hint of fading cultural relevance for them. But do you think in productive ways religion can or should set boundaries for art?
I don't know if I would say it sets boundaries. But it certainly gives me something to dialogue with. Mm-hmm. Because I think one of the things that I certainly share with, say, and I've know a number of priests that I'm good friends with, and I think one thing as an artist, or certainly the way I view my work and my practice and my reasoning for doing what I do, that I share with all my colleagues and friends that are priests, is that we are all deeply concerned with the moral and the ethical kind of issues of our time, and the way that I go about my work is not too dissimilar from the way they often go about theirs. Mm-hmm. And this, I mean, you yourself have referred to me on several occasions as sort of, in this notion of like prophet, in this idea of sort of like unveiling and sort of when the sort of you'll remember the conversations This idea of being an advocate, of sort of unveiling things, of showing things in different contexts, different relationships.
Just be clear to the audience that I'm not a disciple of Michael, prophet, but rather prophetic discourse and a type of language that he's interested in exploring. A key distinction.
Yes. But again, it's those kind of qualities that I think that are shared across the disciplines. And again, if we look at sort of the history of technology and the history of religion, the two sort of intertwine quite often. I mean, you think about sort of the great works that were produced through the ages, through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. You think about, or I think about, say, the invention of the printing press, which was the great sort of mass media transformative technology of that time. And then I think of, the greatest set of, print-based works using that new media of the time, Durer and his woodcuts. So I don't know, for me, I just see the kind of relationship, the dialogue, and to me, it just kind of makes sense.
Well, and for many people, I think, and I speak particularly about America in this case, is that I think there's very little discourse about the public good or about individual introspective inquiry, right? And some of the only ways that surfaces is through religion, whether that's genuine or not. But I think in some cases it really is, right? And we also lack a terminology to express that to a wider public, right? And I think in America, there's a real deficit in this. One of the things we were talking about before we jumped online today was about everyday Britons who are making sacrifices because they know it's the right thing to do to remain inside for others. And looking at this particular moment is that I think especially in America, we're losing a capacity to even formulate that type of question, which has an ethical imperative to it. And one of the only ways to get through to people is through religion. And it's been very interesting, for instance, to watch Donald Trump, who's, to my mind, basically an idolater or an idol, depending on how you formulate it, but saying that he is calling upon, with no mandate, all churches to reopen, right? And those who are wise and intelligent and empathetic religious leaders have said, Mr. President, not only do we not need your permission, but we don't even need a church necessarily to practice our religion. And so it doesn't mean that the church is dispensable, right? The church can be a body of Christ for them that is constituted on Zoom, like my wife does for her, weekly sermons for her church. But that it's interesting to see that one of the only ways to have a dialogue about shoulds, what we should do in a situation, is religious. And I think that's where you often join up with religious discourses in your work, is to have that type of question about a moral imperative.
Yes. So back to the notion of religion, bounding work. I guess the reason I want to kind of move away from that idea is because I don't find that it bounds my work at all in that kind of negative connotation sense. That quite the opposite. It provides kind of this this fertile ground, this entry point, because it is something that people understand. It's something that's so much a part of, say, Western culture, if we're talking about Christianity, that you can start discussing some of the social and the ethical issues that I do in my work, or even if it's something that's a technological issue, but I can discuss it. And if I'm dialoguing with religion, it's not a bounds. It actually provides a point of reference for me to start engaging with my audience. So, like, for example, another piece that comes to mind is the Lamentations for the Forsaken work that you commissioned me to do a number of years ago. And when you approached me, actually, I'll screen share some images and just keep talking. So Let's see. Here we go. So here was the first iteration for the St. Stephen Walbrook iteration there for your Stations London show. And again, sort of it used it was a Stations of the Cross show. So of course it was dealing with the narrative of Christ, his journey to the cross and eventual sort of crucifixion, death, and resurrection. And I used the Turin Shroud image there. And this is when it went to DC in its second version. But the shroud, just for people to kind of get a sense of the piece, it's hard because it was a video, an algorithmic video screen sculpture. But the shroud, the image of Christ, had been actually digitally remade using the names and information about victims in the Syrian civil war. And the different screens actually had different photographic imageries that I had researched and found. And then, sort of with the face of Christ, the body of Christ, the hands of Christ, the feet of Christ, showing different aspects of, their lives and their deaths. And, so this was something that was, of course, a very, explicitly religious thing. But if you remember at the time when you invited me to do a work, I told you I was not going to produce a Christian piece for a Christian audience, and that in this particular instance, that I wanted to take one of the most important stories from Christianity, but then to relate that to a current issue, an issue that involved the people of a different faith, to use the kind of the story of Christ as that kind of that grounding, that focal point,
right?
And then to emanate from that. And I like to think that the work was quite successful. I mean, it was very well received by the Christian community, but in the final resting place at because it is now at Christ Church Cranbrook. I'll go back to the photos. And here it is in its final resting place. There in Detroit, which has one of the largest sort of, I think the largest community of Muslims in the U.S. in the greater Detroit area. The piece was launched, and at the opening event, it was basically a charity dinner for refugees from Syria. And it's funny because I was in these kinds of projects. I've done so many of them over the years. I never really get nervous of what, say, art critics or curators think about the work. But I was super nervous with the piece around this group of Syrian refugees, because I thought to myself, this is your story. And I really hope that I've done it justice and got it right. And thankfully, I mean, they really loved the work and kept telling me how thankful they were for me for producing the piece. But, that was a really nice moment, and also shows how sort of, getting through the tour of that work, through the station show that you put together and the other viewings that it had, Aaron, it allowed for me to, in what is undoubtedly, was a very difficult and continues to be a very difficult time in the U.S., dealing with issues surrounding sort of exclusion, migration, humanitarian aid, and how we treat people and sort of religious tensions, that I was seeking to speak to that Western Christian audience using a language in the story that was so much a part of their life and their culture, and to say, okay, well, this is what it says in the Bible. Here is this story that is so important to us culturally, but what if we actually take that and juxtapose it next to this?
Right. And that's where we found that there was a real resonance with Chagall's White Crucifixion, that it wasn't that it wasn't simply pasting on an iconography, but channeling something in a language that was assimilable to people.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What kind of action do you take on behalf of this so it's interesting that it comes out from your comments. One is that religion, and especially religious history and religious iconography, becomes a way to channel and get very directly to something. And so it sort of cuts across the circuitry of a lot to get to that point. The other thing that comes up is a question that we've just received on our Zoom call is about use of data. And I think it really comes and what ethical boundaries you set. And I think that comes up in that work, and also the undocumented work that and zero tolerance that we worked on together, looking at what I think is, in many cases, become analogous to concentration camps in terms of U.S. detention, especially of children who have crossed the southern border. And especially now that we're dealing with massive outbreaks of disease in these already atrocious holding centers, is that so there's a question of data, but also question just more broadly of people's stories. And I think you feel one of the things that I find very powerful about working with you on projects is that you are so driven to always check to something. How is this received by the people who own these stories? Whose pain is this? And how do I make sure that I'm not being parasitic? How am I transmitting that story and showing aspects of it, but how am I faithful to that experience? And that can be super difficult in general, but also in a work like your Zero Tolerance, if you want to bring that up on the screen.
Yeah. I'll just show a video of that. But maybe what I'll do if you want to.
Because I think what it is you are dealing with stories that the government is trying explicitly not to be shared, not to be from a human or humane perspective. So you're trying to recover stories that are already fractured in their transmission.
Okay, so I'll just show a quick video of this. And this is actually documentation that was done in Billings, Montana, where we launched the piece together. So,
a place full of warehouses. It could be a contemporary art mecca.
Yeah, it was absolutely perfect for it, because before I start the video, I as we discussed, we just didn't want any kind of clinical or even art space for this. We wanted something that was a disused urban warehouse environment, kind of thinking about, because honestly, that was the right thing.
Misinformation out there. What we, the Department of Justice, are doing. The reports have been so wrong. Some people might call it fake news. I saw that too. So let's clear a few things up. Yes, we are pursuing a zero tolerance prosecution policy at the border. Under the laws of this country, illegal entry into America is a misdemeanor, not a felony, but it's a misdemeanor. It's a crime. Re-entry after having been deported is a felony. Under the law, we are supposed to prosecute these crimes, else we, in fact, eviscerate from the code and create a system that allows illegality to run rampant. Under the law, we're supposed to prosecute these crimes, and I've ordered our prosecutors to pursue 100% of the illegal entries on the southwest border that the Department of Homeland Security, our Border Patrol officers, bring to us. If you cross the southwest border unlawfully, then the Department of Homeland Security will arrest you, they'll catch you, and the department will prosecute you. However, we're not sending children to.
So that's just a little kind of glimpse of that piece. And I guess something that for the piece really to kind of make sense to everyone. So the algorithmic video that you saw there, projected of the red and black video, that was made from the then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, his first public speech, where he actually brought forward the notion of his zero tolerance policy. So it was that. The second element was basically documentation footage provided by the border forces themselves. So the U.S. government sort of official press documentation footage of the detention centers, which, yeah, it was.
That was at the
from
time
the government. Yeah, as good as they.
Whether kids should have toothbrushes and whether those were luxury items.
Yes, yeah, things things like that. And then the third bit of the media is an audio recording that was done by ProPublica, the media outlet, that they had basically gotten an investigative journalist sort of had gained sort of secret access into one of the facilities and had recorded basically the conditions, in particular focusing on the children. So it was really those three pieces of media information that I then sort of took in their entirety, but sort of sectioned out, and then algorithmically sort of restitched them. The artwork restitches it together in real time to create this sort of endless loop. So endless variations of the overlay. And yes, it was I think fair to say that it was quite shocking at points where you sort of hear, like, say, Sessions say, we are taking care of these children, and then you hear the voice of a young girl crying out for her mother and father, in Spanish.
The kind of cacophony there. It's like an inverse Pentecost. There was something for those of us who experienced that piece in person. You also brought it to Norway as well, where you paired it with your Sea-Watch piece about rescues from people fleeing from North Africa by boat and having to be rescued from drowning. And so these kind of two sea and land passages, which is interesting, is that certainly in the piece that, as I experienced it, I mean, just really haunting. And you had to toe that line between wanting to evoke that experience. And we did so with the cages.
Yes.
But also to make sure you didn't turn it into a Disneyfication of it, that it was still, you could walk around those screens. It was interesting to watch how people, even there in the museums, sort of obeyed what they thought to be implicit controls that were set up that really weren't. But also, even you were so attentive to every detail. In fact, I just found some of the old bottles the other day in storage, was that you had matched up some of the bottle because there was anonymous cleaning products, which I think certainly connects to discourses of purity and impurity. So there's, people having the equivalent of tinfoil blankets, but they were very attentive to how much bleach was on hand, right? In these facilities. And so there was an industrial sink that happened to be there in in that back part of Kirk's Grocery, a grocery that later became a gallery in Billings. Cool spot.
Here's the picture. Keep talking.
Yeah. And so you just kind of utilize, and we saw it, and we found one of the mop, and we found this sign that talked about slippery floors in Spanish and in English. And so it was something that we really wanted to get that attentiveness to detail, and fidelity was really a guiding part of your experience the entire way through. And also, I think it's kind of maybe insightful for people to see for your research practice that the practice was also originated with us partly through a grant support from the Bishop Fox Fund and the Episcopal Evangelism Society as well. Nationally, is that you came over and we went to the Japanese internment camp at Hart Mountain with Father Gary Waddingham, and how powerful it was to tap into your family's history of internment and to try to find a personal purchase on that story. So as people's experiences were being either outright denied or they're being obfuscated at a governmental level, that what you could do is you could go back into it and research your family history, or you could look at sites that were available and then use that emotional information to sort of process what you wanted to tell.
Yeah, and also I think also really for me it was the historical context to say that there is of course precedent for this kind of action by government, which will at some point in the future be looked upon very differently, hopefully in a very negative light, like say the internment of my mother's side of the family who are Japanese Americans. So yes, I'm half Japanese American, and during World War II, my grandparents on my mother's side, they were all interned in camps. Everything that they had was taken away from them, and all of my grandfather and all of my uncles basically signed up to fight on the Western Front, while their wives and sisters and mothers were behind barbed wire. And of course, moving on, the American government has, apologized for that. Said it was wrong. Of course, it was wrong. But then, that certainly grounded the way that I wanted to tell the story of the current migrant issue at the southern border. It's a different circumstance, but there are things that kind of there are resonances there in terms of humanity, how we treat, it's, and one of the things I was saying, it's not really an issue about, border control or no border control. I personally don't believe in an open border policy. But at the same time, I think any reasonable person would also say, it's not okay to separate families, separate kids, young kids that are 4 and 5 years old, or sometimes even younger, from their parents, to lock them up in kennels, cages.
Well, and that's what for those who weren't able to fully hear that, the Jeff Sessions speech, which you can catch online, is the one where he uses Paul's epistle to the Romans.
Oh yeah.
Very misleadingly, and because he's Jeff Sessions and Alabama is a place with no problematic racial history, he uses a scriptural portion that was used historically to justify slavery, to justify keeping kids in cages, right? And so, so you play that to sort of channel and juxtapose this moment of tremendous religious hypocrisy, and again to call people to account morally there, which is. And I think that's not coincidental that when we see moments of authoritarian-leaning decision-making governmentally across many different countries, I mean, we can look at Brazil just as much as we can look at America, is that there's a denial of multivocality, first of all. That's a number one thing, right? But there's also a desire to deny the voices of artists. This is why it's been historically so important in authoritarian regimes to restrict things like poetry in the Soviet Union. That could only be to the point where many poets simply transmitted verse by verse things, whispered it into the ears of another person who had to commit it to memory, right? And I think in authoritarian regimes, when we begin to see repression of artists, it definitely oftentimes will coincide with these other forms of oppression, right? Because there is a genuine fear there about the arts. And that's what I find interesting when we look at American policy right now and saying, well, fine, okay, if we must cut something, I guess we could sacrifice, the National Endowment for the Arts. Like that was one of the first things that the Trump regime wanted to cut. And especially now in a time of ostensible austerity for the wealthiest nation in the world, right? That we want to cut the role of artists. And it's not just because the arts are seen as peripheral or frivolous. That's partly animated by a fear of the type of thinking that the arts represent.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting for me. I mean, when I was young, growing up in DC, and I would spend so much time at the Smithsonian and going to the kind of the National Gallery, the Hirshhorn. I was far more interested in, the modern and contemporary art, even from a really young age. And how so much has kind of changed, where now I look at myself as, being an artist that's, thankfully gotten his work shown, quite a number of places and over the years. And I do feel that something that is certainly different now is that it's in many ways, I think, been left to the arts to speak truth to power. And I absolutely agree with you, Aaron, that certain governments and regimes are very wary of that. And of course, under the pretense of, art is frivolous, this is a little added extra to society, it makes an easy target when sort of cuts need to be made. But it's not because, there's that it's financially bad. I mean, here in England, for example, it's been well known that for every pound the government spends on the arts, many times that are actually brought into the economy, because the UK is such a powerhouse of creativity and culture. But yet, yes, we do see the cuts, and often it is like under this kind of guise of, it's an unnecessary thing. But I agree with you. I think it's because, these circles now fear the arts, because art has actually progressed to this, evolved to take up these kind of social and ethical things and put them out into the public domain. I mean, I often, when I'm asked about the kind of work that I seek to produce, I absolutely, I think any work should be conceptually robust, have a very interesting idea and basis and context for that, and be well produced and aesthetic. But I take that as a given. The things that I end up wanting to produce are things that, have some kind of important social or ethical, contextual issue about society. So it's that sort of back to unveiling, and what do the people in power not want, the public, you want to hold on to knowledge, right? You want to keep the mystification. You want people to not understand, whether it's the media corporations or corporate power or governments. They don't want the public to understand what exactly is this thing, That's what they don't want.
Absolutely, it's a fear of the unmasking, the unveiling, and a fear. And we talk about on the far right a fear of art. But I think there's also a fear of genuine religion. So what appears to be policies that are congenial and incentivizing a religion, or only preferencing one particular type of religious experience that is at the service of authoritarian power. Not the types of religion that ask the kind of questions that artists are asking. And so it's really inquiry being masked there.
Yeah. I mean, that just makes me think of one of the most interesting keynotes I've ever done was at Virginia Theological Seminary in Virginia. And I did a co-plenary with the Reverend Mark Jefferson. And he had invited me to do this session with him. To we had probably 100, 150 priests in the audience, and one of the things that came out in our conversation is, that what he does and what I do are not too dissimilar. That we're not trying to sort of, in a sense, preach to people in that kind of tell people what to think and what to do exactly. But to have kind of a dialogue and say, okay, have you thought about this? What about this? And if you think about all the things that are kind of going around us, that, that so many different forces, whether it's, the corporations or the governments, really don't want to kind of come and surface to, the wider public, that, people from the arts and people from, religion, when I would say when they're doing their job well, it's they're surfacing these things, allowing people to have a more informed, nuanced view of the world, of things that are actually quite important to them and the people they care about. And that's how we actually enact meaningful change, right?
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap things up, guys. Thank you so much for taking part. That was a really, really interesting conversation. It's fantastic. We're going to post a version of this on our online. So please follow us on. You can check us out here in the comment section at Gazelli Art House on all the social medias. And of course, our website is gazelliarthouse.com. And we will publish a version of this talk online. You can check out Michael's work on our website and his website. And of course, Aaron has put a link there to his project, Home Alone Together, which you should also engage with. It's a really, really great project. And it's works fantastically in this environment of lockdown. So thank you very much for taking part. Thank you, Aaron and Michael. That was a really, really fascinating talk. It was great, and I really appreciate all your time and energy that's gone into that.
Yeah,
so thank
you. Real pleasure. Thanks, George.
Nice one. Take care, everybody. Thank you.